Okay, America. We're already
Sorry.
laughing here. And what happened before this broadcast will be far more interesting than anything that happens during the broadcast. But anyway, welcome to the DMZ America podcast for Monday, October 9th, 2023. Followers of the podcast will note that this is following very shortly on the heels of our previous podcast, where with guest cartoonist Jack Oman, and that's of course because of events in Israel and Gaza. I'm Ted Rall coming to you from the left,
And I'm Scott. Oh, go ahead.
And go ahead.
Okay, I'm Scott Stantis, still coming to you from the right, and it's still interrupting apparently.
Well, no, that was my fault. I didn't cue it up right. You would think that after 120 podcasts, or I should say after 119, because this is number 120, that I would know what I was doing, but apparently not. So Scott, last week I missed you. I was at the Association of American Editorial Cartoonists convention in San Francisco. You were very missed. People asked about you.
Sweet.
And some people were looking to beat you up. I don't know. No,
that goes without saying.
And but anyway, they're looking for you. No, but seriously, so on Saturday,
with the internet, it's so hard to find people. But yeah,
go on. On Saturday night, or I guess this is probably more accurately Friday night local time, at the Gaza Strip. Of course, if you've been following the news, you know that that Hamas, which governs the Gaza Strip ever since it took control in 2007. Bulldozed down a security border fence between Israel and Gaza, launched a coordinated set of rocket attacks and incursions into Israel proper, that resulted in, at this point, well over 1,000 deaths on both sides. At this point, this is one of the rare times when you would say this about an Israel-Palestinian clash. It looks like there's been more Israelis killed at this point than Palestinians. That's almost usually never the way it is. It's usually lopsided the other way. There were people, Hamas fighters coming in on hang gliders, parasailers, rocket attacks. Most notably, there was a rave party taking place that just about 3 miles away from the border fence. And they came in there and shot people and took many, at least 100 people hostage. So at this point, for the first time in its history, Israel has formally declared war. They declared war on Hamas. The Hamas declared war back, although I'm not really sure how that looks, since Hamas is not a nation state that is internationally recognized. But anyway, let's just say they are both very, very angry at one another. Benjamin Netanyahu, who is, of course, the prime minister, in a far-right coalition with even more far-right parties from the ultra-Orthodox wing of the Knesset, he has ordered that power and water be shut off to the Gaza Strip. It's 2.1 million inhabitants. Power has been shut down. No food is going to be allowed into the Gaza Strip. He's declared a complete siege of Gaza, which, unless I'm mistaken, constitutes a war crime under international law because it's collective punishment. Obviously, the vast majority of the population of Gaza is not a member of Hamas, is not involved in this. They're just trying to live their lives. And so anyway, obviously the same thing could be said about the vast majority of Israelis are also not at all involved in far-right politics. Many of them are very liberal. Many of them want improved conditions and are opposed the blockade of the Gaza Strip, which has been in force since 2007, ever since the Hamas takeover. In terms of the summary aspect, Scott, am I missing anything?
No, the attack came shocking. It came as a surprise, which tells you a little bit about the intelligence of intelligence communities and their value or lack thereof. Israel was totally blindsided by this. They did not see this coming, which is shocking. It just goes back to my point that, we somehow have this sense. I think movies have corrupted it, that intelligence agencies know all. They do deep dives and they know things. Well, they don't. That's lesson number one. Lesson number two here is the brutality of it. Hamas now holds, as Ted mentioned, over 100 hostages, and God knows what's going to happen. One of the people they took from the rave, they stripped her naked, marched her through the streets, raped her, beat her, and then killed her. This is not. This is a brutal, savage attack. And this is where Ted and I have disagreed in the past. We're going to disagree today. I've been a very strong supporter of Israel. That has been eroded significantly over the last decade because of its treatment of the Palestinians and its treatment of occupied territories. More and more, it struck me, it was actually voiced best by a writer who passed away recently, one of my favorites, P.J. O'Rourke, who I thought very highly of. And in his writings from Holidays in Hell, All the Troubles in the World, he ventured into the West, into Israel, said it's awesome, it's amazing. And then he ventured into the Palestinian territories, and he had the most succinct take on the Israel occupation, which was, this is bullshit. He says it's apartheid, and you can't be a democracy and subjugate a part of your population. Those two ideas do not jibe. They cannot adhere. So my view of Israel has, as I said, has been diminished, but my support has not. What's interesting to me, Ted, there's a lot to unpack here. So let's begin. The American response, especially the Biden administration's response, was this full-throated, backing of Israel. You issued a column this weekend, and and as you often do, challenge the dominant paradigm and say, listen, it's very similar to what happened to 9/11. You wrote this back then as well, which is to say, you thump people on the head long enough, they're going to thump you back, and yes, it may be inappropriate, it may be self-destructive, but for those of us who have had children, we know that that's not an unusual thing for a human being to do. And your take is that that's what this is, that they finally just said enough is enough.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the thing is, what's happened is that Israel has a very deep divide between sort of the more secular liberal Israelis who favor a two-state solution and want to live in peace and harmony with their Palestinian and Arab neighboring states, and the more hardcore revanchist settler colonialist mentality that views all of Israel, and they view all of former Palestine, including the West Bank and Gaza, as the Holy Land and rightfully part of theirs, and should be purged completely of Palestinians who should somehow either be killed or driven out or something. And so the unfortunate thing is that right-wing part, the right-wing Israelis have dominated Israeli politics. And so they've won the argument. And so the mentality has been, we don't want any bus bombings anymore. We don't want any mall bombings, any cafe bombings. So what we're going to do is, rather than try to live alongside these people, we're going to pen them in, and then periodically, whenever we feel that they're getting a little uppity, like they're firing like their Scud rockets into Israel or whatever, we're going to bomb the shit out of those positions that are, we believe, Hamas or is at, or Hezbollah in Lebanon. And that's been basically the when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail mentality. And look, there's an argument to be made for that, right? Like, basically that argument is, these people are never going to accept the state of Israel and our right to exist. And therefore we can't live side by side. We're never going to have a modus a modus vivendi. That will not happen. So we're going to we're just going to keep them contained until we can figure out some way to get rid of them entirely. And that is it is a point of view. I don't adhere to it, but that's been dominant. I think that what what we're seeing here is, you just can't. The Israelis created a powder keg. They created a pressure cooker, right? I mean, they surrounded an area that's hot, and overcrowded. The cliche is that it's the densest populated place in the world. That's not really true. Actually, Tel Aviv is more densely populated than Gaza, but it is very densely populated. It's overcrowded, and basically the Israelis have cut it off from the world, and they control it. Even the ocean is controlled. They can't even the Gazans can't even control their own port. The Israelis control the port. So basically, the Israelis decide if and when the Gazans get electricity or water or food, or computer equipment. In the case of computer equipment, they can't get computer equipment. So I'm not even kidding. They're like running like Windows 97 on ancient computers in Gaza. So it's completely cut off from the world, and the conditions have been extremely brutal. I mean, it was not a rich place to begin with, but now you have unemployment of 50%, the highest on the planet. I mean, to compare this, Afghanistan post-US withdrawal has a 30% unemployment rate. I mean, so Afghanistan is rocketed compared to Gaza. The 80% of the citizens of Gaza are suffering from malnutrition and food insecurity, and live under the poverty line. So just, these are people living under extremely dire straits. And of course, the people who are employed are barely making anything and barely able to make ends meet. So what the Israelis have done is made it impossible, really, for Gaza to become economically powerful. And I would argue that that is self-destructive for Israel. I think probably the best thing that Israel could possibly have is a Gaza and West Bank unified Palestinian state that is thriving economically and therefore would have a lot to lose by losing peace.
Yeah.
Right now, what they've done is they've put people into a situation where they feel like things are hopeless. And they're so hopeless that even though they know the Israelis are going to retaliate brutally, they feel like they need to get the world's attention because the world has turned away from the Palestinians. And that's not untrue. The UAE recently normalized, relations with Israel. Saudi Arabia was flirting with doing that, and they might have. Saudi Arabia is a radical Muslim state that exports Wahhabi jihadism all over the world. And if they were going to get together with Israel, it was like, holy shit. Like at that point, like really nobody cares about us. And that's been like, I've been like fighting online since yesterday with partisans of Israel. And I'm basically arguing this. If you want to argue that what you described, the atrocity, the rape and murder and taking of hostages as atrocities, and decry those and change your, put an Israeli flag on your avatar online, you're not wrong. But I'm not going to listen to you if you also didn't have like a Palestinian flag in honor of the people who were being bombed during the 2014 Israeli invasion of Gaza, the indiscriminate bombings. I've had some exchanges with people who I used to consider friends who are like, well, when Israel attacks, it attacks precise positions. It's like, okay, having been in places, I've been to Gaza and the West Bank, and having been to places that are bombed indiscriminately, there is no such thing as a precision bombing. A bomb falls into a densely populated area, it hits gas lines, it takes out the entire block. Hundreds of people die when you were trying to get one. The buildings collapse on people who are driving by or walking by. It is just those were atrocities too. The Israelis have been demolishing people's homes who had nothing to do with terrorism or any kind of political involvement. They kidnap people, they torture them, they detain them based on their party affiliation. They have assassinated people, in many cases innocent. So the point here is, like, we should, as humanists, decry all forms of violence directed at civilians. And no matter what, no matter who the perpetrator and no matter who the victim is, the problem is it's like all American politics, it's tribal. So if you're on the left, you've been upset about Gaza. And if you're on the right, you didn't give two shits. Now it's like, if you're on the left, you're like, well, where were you for Gaza? And the people on the right are like, we stand with Israel. And even RFK Jr. is standing with Israel, to the point where people on the left are saying that's the end of his candidacy. He has destroyed his support among progressives. So
I thought being loopy did that, but that maybe I'm old fashioned. Okay, so counterpoint is that Israel stood for decades as the shining light of democracy, enlightenment, free speech, free press in the Middle East. That was and they had every right to be held up to that because they lived up to it. They were a democracy. The Palestinian and any minority living in Israel could vote. They could exercise their religion. But in the last decade or so, some kind of weirdness has seeped in. The religious parties, the extreme parties, have moved in and marginalized. And if you listen to the language over the last, say, 10, 15 years, Ted, coming from Israelis, especially Israelis who were, building settlements in disputed territory. They shouldn't have been doing it. And the state all of a sudden decided, yeah, that's okay with us, even though we've agreed that we wouldn't do this. But the language from the settlers is just, they're talking about these animals, these terror. They're not even human. They need to be destroyed. They need to be wiped off the face of the planet. They need to be eradicated. Gee, where have we heard that language before?
Yeah, that's genocidal language.
Yeah, and it absolutely is. And unfortunately, that political stand has become more and more prevalent in Israel. And so as someone,
now, of
like
course,
I said,
in fairness to them, they would say, well, we hear the Palestinians chant death to Israel and all that. I mean,
right, but that's wrong. That's whatism. I mean, when did that become?
But by the way, death to Israel is different than like we want to kill all Jews. That's not the same thing.
Yeah, but that's implied. There's an awful lot of anti-Semitism and a lot of genocidal fervor towards Jews in that phrase and in that sentiment. You know it.
That's true, but it's more of a subtext. It's not as direct. It's like if you say death to America, it's not the same thing as specifically saying all Americans should be killed.
In the 70s, I think I've talked about this before, but I'll mention it again. I actually they had recruiters from Israel go around the United States, going to Jewish communities and saying, would you want to join the Israeli army and see the world? Well, you see a really small part of it, but
you see a part of the world that's roughly the size of New Jersey. Yes.
Exactly. But I was such a rabid supporter of Israel. I actually met with a recruiter from the Israeli army, and they said, well,
but you're not Jewish.
That did come up.
Yes.
They said, are you Jewish? I go, no. Do you speak Hebrew? No.
Uh-huh.
What kind
You're
of,
I like bagels.
I love bagels, but I love the state of Israel, but they were like, what other physical things do you have? And I'm legally blind in my left eye. And they just went, it may be better served if you stayed in the United States and supported Israel there.
Remotely.
I'm such a defective human being.
You were like an early, zoom in. You can do it. Support us by Zoom. Work at home
by Zoom. But I mean, just full disclosure to say that I am that rabid of a supporter of Israel and always have been. And I noticed that my right-wing friends today are just like you said, they're like, Israel must live, which is very interesting to me. I was actually not subjected to the right wing, the Christian right wing's adoration of Israel until I moved here to Birmingham.
They have that weird thing where they think that the Megiddo, it'll bring that's the Megiddo is where the word Armageddon comes from. That it's like the end, the Israeli conflict will bring about the end times, and they think that's a good thing. I always heard end times and thought bad thing, but that's me.
Yeah. Well, because you're not on the winning side, Ted. You just don't get it. No, and I did not know that was a thing until I came here. And the governor of Alabama at the time, a guy named Fob James, traveled to Israel frequently and was a massive supporter of Israel. Now I'm looking at right-wing news sites this morning, and they're just going batshit crazy and saying, "Oh, go Israel, yay!" But
And
to that,
and frankly, so is Joe Biden, who is obviously, I would say, is too far right for me, but he's not objectively in our system a right winger. This has been a a main line of support. You're even some members of the squad have been expressing uh, unequivocal support for Israel, and I guess I have problems with unequivocal
yeah,
anything,
anything.
and I don't, and I will say, like, I want to, I think the issue of like Israel's right to exist, we should discuss. I mean, personally, I'm as good as anyone at pointing out that, like, look, when I don't understand at the end of World War II. I mean, I understand how it happened because I study history, but in the history of Zionism and all that. But I do think at the end of World War II, when after Germany slaughtered 6.8 million Jews just for fun, that maybe the Jewish homeland as a nation state should have been established in Germany.
Yes, in
Like,
fact, that was proposed. Did you know
no, I did not know that.
Shortly following the war?
Not to mention, that's where most European Jews lived. They lived in Europe.
Yeah,
Wouldn't it would have been an easier place to get used to than the desert.
And you weren't surrounded by people who, hated you.
And where other people lived who had nothing to do with what happened to you.
Yeah, look it up. There were maps that were drawn up of Israel, of a Jewish state. It was, I believe, in the southern part of Germany.
So how was that dismissed?
I think the Zionists said, no, we're going to Israel. Israel is our destiny. And
yeah, because they'd been on about that for about 70 years, right? So,
well, so for some would say 4,000, but
really 70,
Yeah, well, and the Palestinians living in that time in that area were a little surprised. It would be like, could you imagine if they showed up in New Jersey and just said, "Okay, this is our new country"?
Yeah, this is like if we just say, like, oh, the Kurds, we're going to give the Texas to the Kurds.
Oh, like, please do.
Well, that's actually a good idea. But like, it's like, yeah, it's sort of like with the Palestinians, like, but we had nothing to do with the Holocaust at all, and so and many of us are Christian, and it's like, whatever. So
but I see the religious and I see the historic context of the Zionist movement, of why they'd want to move back
I understand why they want
to Judea. Makes perfect sense.
But obviously, then there's the Nakba, the tragedy, as the Arabs call it, right, in 1948, when mass expulsions, kind of equivalent to what we saw recently in Nagorno-Karabakh in Azerbaijan, where 120,000 Armenians basically fled because they thought they were all about to be killed by the Azeris. Fortunately, that didn't happen. But
I'd say the partition of India.
Right. Well, that's brutal. Millions of people died. And so in this case, the Israelis are living on occupied land. They did not try to negotiate or make peace with the Palestinians. And that's the thing. Ultimately, I'm sorry. I know supporters of Israel always say, like, they want to live in peace. They don't act like it. They don't look like people who are really serious about peace. These are not people who are like reaching out to their counterparts in even Fatah, much less Hamas and Hezbollah, and saying, let's sit down, let's fucking talk. And it's not like they do that and then Hezbollah says, eat shit, fuck you. They're not making any moves. And here's the thing. Israel is by far the most powerful component of this equation, right? They have the support of the international community, international recognition. They have the support of the United States, the biggest and most important country in the world. They have more money. They have they have a bigger military. They are armed to the teeth. They're a nuclear power. And their army is exquisitely trained, and they have an awesome intelligence agency. Well, at least it was awesome until Friday. And so let's face it. I mean, Hezbollah and Hamas are cobbling together a resistance, out of rocks and like baling wire and duct tape. So it's always incumbent when there's a huge power chasm, a divide, for the person who the side that has the most power to make by far all the overtures and the concessions. They have to. It's like if you have a problem between a father and a son, It's the father's job to do 95% of the compromising. And it's like that, Israel's the big Mac daddy there. They've got to fucking make all the effort. And there's been no sign that Netanyahu or his immediate predecessors have had any interest in seriously trying to resolve
right.
this
But
matter.
I'm going to walk back the Camp David Accords that came very close between having a peace between Israel at the time, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, PLO, and Arafat. And the Palestinians got 94%, 96% of what they wanted, and they walked away. Now, you and I really disagree on this. You think they should have walked away. I said, there's no way. You're that close to getting everything you want. You take it, and you work towards getting the last 6%. What this attack has done and what it will do, and you and I both know this because the world is full of people who can't see nuance or balance. You're going to have the kind of response that President Biden had, which is we're all in for Israel. And now Israel is going to be able to do. I hate war. I got to take a side issue. I despise war. War is stupid. They're going to be able to exercise a full-throated attack on those territories now. And the world is going to look on and say, that's okay. To your point, Ted, yes, I've encouraged Israel through my cartoons, through my center clip posts, and said, listen, we need to, you need to be the bigger person here. Someone has to be like you alluded to, someone has to be the adult in the room. And it falls to Israel. Israel says, why do we always have to be the adult? Well, because you're the adult. You have all the stuff. You have the keys to the car. You own the house. That's with those privileges come responsibility. The last, like I said, decade and a half, they have not exercised that responsibility in a way that you and I would probably agree that they should have. Going forward from this point, Ted, though, I see heartache. I see, you mentioned that they are now having a siege of the Gaza Strip. They've cut off water, they've cut off power, and they've cut off food. That means you're going to have starvation, and you're going to have people dying in the hospitals because there's no electricity to treat their ailments. Mm-hmm. But going forward, Israel now has been given what I think a lot of the right wing, and especially the more rabid religious parties and nationalist parties have been dying for. They're now given a blank check for the next month. They're going to be able to do whatever they want to do.
Well, that's true. It'll be just like what happened here after 9/11, coming back full circle to the beginning of this podcast, right? Where, the George W. Bush on September 10th, 2001, was a unpopular president who is widely viewed by many people as illegitimate. His approval rating shot up to 91%. He was given carte blanche to invade Afghanistan and then Iraq. The USA Patriot Act, which stripped away all of our basic privacy protections, was passed overnight by a Congress who didn't even bother to read it, and is still in force. Yeah. They legalized torture and all NSA domestic surveillance of every American citizen. They went fucking hog wild. Opened Guantanamo, extraordinary rendition.
Right. And the neocons
nuts. That's exactly
what the neocons had all these theories, right? They had all these things, preemptive war. Remember that? That was a big one.
Yeah.
But all of those theories that, that maybe maybe Americans were getting a little too uppity and had a few too many freedoms.
Yeah. That's always the problem.
Too many freedoms.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Yeah. So you're President Rall. What do you do?
Well, before I get into the Rall, the highly fictional, highly theoretical Rall presidency, I just want to read you some of the things that just to counter what you were saying about how Ehud Barak supposedly offered the Palestinians 96% of the West Bank for a state. But I'm just going to read this. Barak actually offered the Palestinians 96% of Israel's definition of the West Bank. They didn't include any areas already under Israeli control, such as settlements, the Dead Sea, or the Jordan Valley. Effectively, that meant that Barak was going to annex 10% of the West Bank back to Israel, with an additional 10% remaining under temporarily Israeli control for the foreseeable future. In exchange, the Palestinians would get 1% of desert land near the Gaza Strip. So the Palestinians lose 10% of the most fertile land in exchange for 1% of desert land. Also, the Israelis wanted permanent control of Palestinian airspace, 3 permanent military installations manned by Israeli troops inside the West Bank, Israeli soldiers at all Palestinian border crossings, and also, Israel would be allowed to invade at any point in cases of emergency. What constituted an emergency was not defined and subject to interpretation. The Palestinian state would be completely demilitarized without any army whatsoever. The government of Palestine would not be allowed to enter into any alliance without Israeli permission. Also, in the case of East Jerusalem, there would be no Palestinian sovereignty over the majority of the city, including Palestinian cities, even though the Palestinians view East Jerusalem as part of Palestine. And it goes on and on like that. So, I mean, the point is that, like, and also I know one of the things that they didn't have in this little essay was the Israelis also wanted to have like corridors where like they had highways that only they could operate in that like sort of crisscrossed the West Bank so that they could come in and out anytime they wanted in order to send in the military or the police. I mean, that's not a sovereign state. I mean, it's like what I just described is not a real country. So they, you know, I can see why they walked away from it.
Well, they didn't just walk away from it. That's when they a fatwa. They launched more attacks, and that's when the
Intifada.
bus bombing, Intifada, and that's when the bus bombings began, and that's when Israel built the walls.
Now, that's true. Now, I should also say that Israel is an apartheid state is something that Jimmy Carter said many years ago, and it was already true when I visited the first time in 2000. That was, by the way, a moment. It was the last moment of optimism. When I was in Jerusalem, I saw they had assigned Palestinian police officers to patrol side by side with Israeli police officers who were training them. So basically, it was looking like they were moving to a two-state solution, and the Palestinian Authority police were being trained by the Israelis one-on-one. And you'd see them, like, it was really cool. Like, you'd see them like joking together. They had camaraderie. They're smiling. They smoking together. It was awesome. And then just like a week or two after I left, Sharon went to the Temple Mount, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, as a deliberate act of provocation, and that triggered the Intifada. You know, and you know, part of the problem here for someone like me on the left is that, like, look, these are in many, like, Hamas is like, you know, they're radical Muslims, and that means by definition they're religious fanatics, and I don't believe in religion. So I'm like, you guys are like furious about the quote unquote desecration of like the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Well, the Al-Aqsa Mosque is just a building and nothing's holy because religions aren't real. And so you're killing people over something that's not true. And like, so it is an issue for me, but I have to say, as a member of the left, I cannot countenance any kind of suppression and oppression, particularly systemic and sustained, which is what we're seeing here on the part of what the Israelis have been doing. And like, look, the fundamental problem goes to the core of the Israeli state when it was founded. And I do want to address the idea of like Israel's right to exist. First of all, no country has a right to exist. The US doesn't have a right to exist. Countries exist because they set up shop, they define a border, and they can successfully defend that border against possible incursions. That gives you the right to exist. Like being, you know, every country on earth, or you live in a place that nobody cares about and nobody bothers to invade, right? Those are basically your right to exist. And, you know, you can just look at a map of, you know, the world 100 or 500 or 1,000 years ago to see that borders such as they were in very different places, and countries and empires that no longer exist. You know, did Parthia have a right to exist? You know, it's a stupid question. The point is, Israel does exist, and it will continue to exist until it doesn't. And same thing with Palestine. But the idea that you know, you can get your way by brutalizing an entire population is just untenable. And that's, it was inevitable. This was going to happen. I'm surprised it wasn't bigger. I'm surprised it took so long, to be honest.
This is pretty damn big. I mean, come on. I mean, this is 1,000 casualties, 1,100 now as of today, as of right now. This is a big thing. Although I'm flummoxed. I'm trying to think what the end game is for Hamas. What do they think is going to happen? And we probably should tie this up a little bit. But yeah. Hamas, also, what is Iran's role in all of this? Was this their way of derailing what was clearly going to be an Israel-Saudi Arabia peace agreement of some kind? What I mean, okay, help me here, Ted, because I don't get it. And this is what's so infuriating, so mind-boggling, especially for Western minds. I think 9/11 was one of those instances. What did they hope to achieve? That there would be an uprising of Muslims and that they'd all attack the United States and we'd, cease to exist? Or, I mean, is it strictly a juvenile swipe at the perceived authority? And
I don't think it's a juvenile. It's not a juvenile swipe. I mean, look, these are not stupid people. They are people who this was extremely well planned. As you pointed out, they got past the Mossad. I mean, look, we can tie two issues together. Obviously, look, Iran is the patron of Hamas. And so this probably almost certainly was a Hamas idea. The operation was conceived entirely by Hamas. And they probably, of course, when the plan was ready, then they wanted to consult with their Iranian counterparts in the Revolutionary Guard. And they said, look, this is what we're thinking of doing. What do you think? Are you okay with it? They wouldn't do it if the Iranians had vetoed it. And the Iranians may have added some edits to the plan. So that's to what extent that constitutes involvement is, I guess, subjective. But I think that's what happened. And but it's interesting to me that they were able to have those conversations without being eavesdropped upon by Mossad or any of the the multiple eyes communities that are partnered with Israel, like the US, like the NSA, GCHQ in Britain, and so on. So it is interesting that they were able to do that. They obviously must have used very basic means, maybe even like runners, and done it that way.
Yeah.
And that leads me to believe that but what's the goal, right? So terror, this is an act, it's a basically, let's just say this is asymmetric warfare. It's guerrilla warfare. You can call it terrorism, that's a loaded term, but it's asymmetric warfare. So what is the purpose of it? And the purpose of it, as Che Guevara, who wrote the book on guerrilla warfare, said, the purpose is to basically shake things up. You're trying to get attention for a cause that would otherwise be ignored, which clearly was the case. You mentioned the negotiations with Saudi Arabia. Already, Israel had moved toward normalized relations with the United Arab Emirates. These Saudi Arabia and UAE have long given lip service to the Palestinian cause. This is kind of marked even the end of lip service. And so, Hezbollah and Hamas and Fatah all know that this means the world has forgotten about them. So the point here is we're still here. There's 2 million of us. We're penned in. We're miserable. We're pissed off. We're going to, if we're going to hurt, some of you are going to hurt too. Part of it is also about domestic, make no mistake, this is about domestic support. I mean, the Hamas domestic politics in Gaza says, we are the Palestinian resistance. We have our brave fighters who are resisting the Zionist entity. And if you can't keep saying that and then never do it. You have to actually do it sometimes. You can't be like China, where you're like, we're a socialist state and we have communism, even though you don't. In China, you can get away with that. So even though the bombs are going to be raining down on Gaza and are raining down on Gaza, it's basically like telling the people there, we're fighting for you. Yeah, even though this will temporarily make you more miserable, in the long run, we're getting closer to liberation. And so I think they're playing a longer game than the Israelis. The Israelis are just trying to keep the lid on the pot. And that's not a good idea, because you can't keep the lid on the pot because the heat's on. It's going to blow up every now and then. But that's their approach. The the people of Palestine are really looking to, like, I may not, there are people there who still have the house key of the house that they were kicked out of in 1948, that their grandparents put in a frame, like, in their house, and then, like, with a description of where it was, or the original deed, and then they died, and then their kids died, and now, like, it's the grandkids house, and they're old. I mean, so they're playing the long game. They're like, maybe my grandkids will live in free Palestine. So I think that's what this is about. What do you think?
I I've had to talk to you about things like this because I don't understand what the end game is. I don't understand. Like I said, 9/11 was just to this day, I'm still going, what in the hell were you thinking? What did you think was going to happen when you did this? That we were somehow, that America was going to genuflect and say, oh, you're right. Oh, but
We should withdraw from Saudi Arabia. Yeah.
Yeah. That wasn't going to happen. So that's what I meant by juvenile. That's what I meant by just striking out. You guys are pissing us off, so we're going to lash out at you. And in this instance, you and I both know now what's going to happen over the next 30 days is going to be horrific.
True.
And it's you're talking about, and I mentioned it at the top of the podcast, the genocidal language of many Israelis towards Palestinians and the dehumanization of Palestinians. Again, we've heard this before, and it didn't end well. I suspect America is going to have a difficult time supporting Israel as we see more and more horrific things happen. Right now, they're saturating bombing places. They're bombing mosques. They're apparently, on purpose.
Yeah.
And I know you just stated your religious manifesto, but this is a significant attack on Islam. Does this bring in some of the other, more radical players in the region? I don't know. Does Iran rather, come in and actually have more material support? I'm not sure what that looks like. But
I don't think they could. There's no way, because of the blockade, right? I mean, how do they get it there? They can't.
Well, and that's the thing. So now you're talking about Palestinians shooting their bolt in terms of the arms they have, the munitions they have, and Israel can now move in and do. I hope and pray they don't. But the opportunity here for them to do the unthinkable is now a possibility, and the world will stand back and go, yeah, these people had it coming. Well, nobody has it coming, by the way.
No.
So I think that's what scares all of us is what's coming now.
Well, we talked a little bit about this before the pod, and I think it's worth repeating for the pod that, I think that, like, a lot of times what makes these stories so interesting and hard to analyze is that there's two cultures clashing, two, that means different ways of thinking. And, like, if I were in the room with the planners at Hamas, and this idea had come up, I would have been like, guys, you should just know, like, what's going to happen now. Like, basically, if you attack civilians, the world's going to decide that they're done with you, and they're not going to care what the Israelis do. And right. So, and it's not going to get you that seat at the UN, that you want, right? Like, I would say, like, if you want now, what you want to do is issue, first of all, nobody understands what you're about. You need to issue, like what ISIS did. You need to issue, like, well-produced videos in every Western language that explains your grievances and why you're attacking, and shows the grievances, right? Like the misery, the closed hospitals, the people who can't get X-ray because X-ray machines are not allowed to be imported into the West Bank. you show those grievances, then it's like that goes on social media, that changes hearts and minds. And then when you attack, you can't go after civilians. If you encounter civilians, you have to protect them and safeguard them. And then you only attack military targets. Think about 9/11. I mean, 9/11, who did they kill? Primarily like 2,800 people who were low-level and mid-level office workers who had, by the way, a democratic, liberal-leaning city, where probably the vast majority of those people did not even vote for George W. Bush or his policies in the Middle East or neoconservatism at all. It's kind of like you killed a bunch of the wrong people. But also look at 9/11. The attack on the Pentagon, even though 200 people were on that plane, we don't really talk much about that, right? Like that's like the and also it's the asterisk. We talk about the World Trade Center. That World Trade Center, the Twin Towers, gets 99% of the ink about 9/11.
Well, we have video of it too. Don't forget we were watching it live.
That's
so
true.
I think there's something.
There's a little, although there's a little. I guess there is some surveillance footage of the first of the plane hitting the Pentagon. But point taken. But I think it's subconscious. I think psychologically Americans know the Pentagon is a legitimate military target, and that's why we don't care as much about it. And even though we've all read the horror stories about the Pentagon, like, how horrible it was for the people who were there. It's still like, it's the Pentagon. It's your fair game. And people are going to hear me and say that's not true. It is true. People don't ever talk about the Pentagon. They talk about the World Trade Center.
I disagree.
And then they talk about Shanksville. They talk about that more than they talk as an act of bravery, but they do not talk about the Pentagon. And I think and my point is that's why, if you're going to engage in this sort of act, like in the French Resistance and those kind of Western resistance movements against Nazi occupation in World War II, they really tried to avoid hurting civilians because it was like, this will fuck us up. This will ruin our reputation. We have to be seen as respectful of civilians. But Arab culture, they don't do that. Like if you think about the Algerian independence struggle in France, they bombed cafes, they bombed restaurants where ordinary people were. That's like not part of Arab culture. They're like, it's fair, everyone's fair game. And that's, causes, again, it causes a overreaction. But on the other hand, the overreaction is also part of what you want when you launch an asymmetric attack. You want the overreaction because one of your biggest problems, if you're like, say, Hamas or Hezbollah, is you have moderates in your own society who think you go too far. You're too out there. And you need to convince them that your enemy, in this case, Israel or the United States, that they are the monsters that you say they are. And by provoking them to attack, and then when the US comes in or Israel comes in and bombs the shit out of Gaza or Lebanon or Iraq or Afghanistan, it does radicalize people who were moderates. And it's like, oh God, yeah, Hamas was right all along. The Israelis really are bastards.
Okay. So that gives us a window into the motivation, which I always kind of stumble over. So, okay, what happens? So what looking forward, I mean, I've already said what I think is going to happen. Do you agree? It's just going to be,
it'll be Israel a pig fuck. I mean, it's going to be just, horrible. So, I mean, I agree with your analysis of your prediction. I mean, I think you're just going to see, here, I guess the thing is, what can the Israelis do? The Israelis cannot really directly occupy a population of 2 million people in a restive, hateful population that hates them, not that are inherently hateful, but contemptuous population forever. They can't, and they can't just absorb them into Israel proper or annex them. So somehow, I could see them trying to like overthrow the Hamas government and install an Israeli puppet government for Gaza. I could really see that. That if I were in the room advising the Israelis, I'd be like, that's your move. Like install a puppet regime.
And what happens to the hostages? I mean, that's the other thing. If they continue,
you negotiate for them. you release Palestinians from who are there's always thousands of Palestinian activists and political opponents in Israeli prisons at any given time, most of whom have committed no crime whatsoever. You
Well,
trade
apparently the number of hostages now equal the number of roughly the Palestinians in Israeli jails. So it looks like
so
that's
yeah, in the past, typically there's been like a ratio, right? Like there's been like 10 Palestinians released for every one Israeli or whatever. That can't play out that way this time.
And to bring in another issue that Ted gets in hot water about, Vladimir Putin allegedly this morning wagged his finger at the United States, saying, if you actually paid attention to your actual allies instead of spending money in arms to Ukraine, you may have been able to stop this. I got
well, that's actually a really interesting point, right? So I don't understand, first of all, why the Israelis would really need any additional weaponry, considering that they are by far the biggest recipient of American military hardware in the world. Them and Egypt, they get like $4 billion a year each. I don't get it, like why they need more, but anyway, they're asking for more. And Biden said he's sending more, but we're out of artillery already. We're out of ammo. Like if Canada wants to invade, this is their chance. Like we can't defend our own borders. Like we don't have enough. We don't have enough to send the Ukrainians. We don't have enough to send. We can't really do both Israel and Ukraine. We really can't. So like we got to choose one. I mean, ideally we would choose neither, as far as I'm concerned. But they're gonna. I mean, the U.S. is stretched out. I mean, the U.S. is also like, look, Israel's like little U.S. They act the same way. We do the same shit. And you know, what happens is we go around, like you'd say, banging everyone on the head. Then we're surprised when people get annoyed. I mean, it's like, and so like now, I mean, I would argue that Russia is like invading you. Who cares about Ukraine? This war has established them as a major player on the international scene that they were not before. They're now, like, China was their frenemy at best. Now they're buds. India, they hardly had any relationship with at all. Now they're buds. I mean, that's half the world's population right there. And then they have Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa
NATO
coalition, BRICS. The BRICS coalition with 25 countries, it's going to be like a major economic bloc challenge where they're going to be able to go after the US dollar as the world's reserve currency. I mean, Russia, this is like, the US has gone a little too far. If they had just sort of stayed out of, if they'd stayed out of it, there would have never been a Russian invasion of Ukraine anyway, because the Ukrainians would never have thought that they could join NATO, which they should not, So
I think the invasion sort of put the lie to that idea. Clearly, Russia was a threat to them, and they needed some protection. And Russia viewed them as a threat.
That's right.
Anyway, so back to Israel. I mean, well, I think we've said all we needed to say. What do you think?
Yeah, we'll follow this story.
You think?
I suspect that it's, I mean, unless you get like a nuclear escalation, I actually don't think anything, this is going to be a really gross way to say it, but from a media perspective, I don't think anything interesting is going to happen in the next few days. I think it's going to be like the usual sad cycle of now the US, I mean, Israel and its allies, mainly the US, will participate in mopping up operations. They will go into Gaza with troops. They will ruthlessly bomb and crush and shoot everything that moves. And the people of Gaza will be terrorized and hiding out and hoping to survive and subsist. And then the Israelis are going to have to figure out how to administer this fucking mess. And the one thing about, be careful about getting rid of a government without having a good one to replace it. Something that we learned in Afghanistan and Iraq and Libya.
There we go. So, Ted, where can we see things Ted Rall?
Well, you can check out my, I co-host a radio show on Radio Sputnik Monday through Friday, 10 a.m. to 12 noon Eastern. You can find it on Rumble, and at Radio Sputnik. Go to whowhatwhy.org on Saturdays And you can go to, I'm a frequent contributor to the Wall Street Journal. And Rall.com, RALL.com. And Scott, where can we find all Scottian things?
Scottian things.
Or
You can go to
Scottish?
that was my, I don't even know what the hell that was. I can't do a Scottish accent, even though I'm named after those fine people. You can go to gocomics.com/Scott Stantis, one word. Go to gocomics.com/Prickly City and see my political comic strip. You can go to chicagotribune.com and see a gallery of my work in the opinion section. And you can go to Centerclip, which is a app you can get for free, which is a bunch of mini podcasts, 30 seconds, no longer than 5 minutes. Ted contributes, I contribute. We have a lot of other fine people contributing. Very much worth the listen. And then, of course, there's always the DMZ America podcast, which I'm extremely proud of.
Me too.
So,
all right, Scott, always a pleasure. Until
all right,
next
bro.
time.
Adios. Shalom.